Hi, I'm Teacher Dennis, and I'm here today to continue the IELTS Speaking series. Today's topic is books, and today we'll cover vocabulary that will help you answer the IELTS speaking questions, such as, do you like to read? What kinds of books do you like to read? And tell me about a book that you recently read and what you liked about it. Let's get started. Okay, the first words we're going to talk about are about your reading habits. The first word we have is big reader. Now this is a word that describes a person and their reading habits. So a big reader is someone who reads a lot. Me personally, I'm a big reader. So you might get a question on the IELTS like, tell me about your reading habits, or do you often read? And you could answer, yeah, I'm a big reader. I read in all my free time, or I read every night. Avid reader is the same idea. It means the same thing as big reader. An avid reader is a big reader. It's just a different word for it. Now, avid means something, it means that you really like to do something and you do it a lot. So you could be an avid reader, you could be an avid basketball player, you could be an avid cook, you could be an avid model maker, you could be an avid almost any sort of like hobby. So these words, both of these are, you could use them interchangeably. You could say, if somebody asks you, do you like to read? Do you often read? You can say, I'm a big reader. You could say, I'm an avid reader, and both of those would be okay. But remember, for the IELTS, you don't want to just have one sentence. You want to say 2 or 3 sentences. So if somebody asks you, do you often read? You can say, I read a lot. I'm an avid reader. I usually have a book in my bag with me or in the car seat next to me because I really like to read. So our next word is bookworm. And this is an idiom. And it's something that you use to describe a person. And this, we just talked about big reader and avid reader. A bookworm likes to read even more than that. A bookworm always has his or her nose in a book. They've always got their nose in the book, any sort of free time. So if somebody on the IELTS, if you were asked, tell me about your reading habits, you could say, I always have my nose in a book. I'm a bookworm. I really like to read because it makes me feel happy and excited and enjoyable. The next word we've got is bedtime reading. And bedtime reading is not really to describe you as a reader or another person as a reader. It's used to describe the kind of thing you like to read at bedtime. So the kind of reading you do at bedtime, or when you're in bed going to sleep. So you might say, if somebody says, if you asked on the IELTS exam, do you read in bed? You could say something like, yeah, I do read in bed. I usually like to read science fiction as my bedtime reading. But sometimes it's a little bit too exciting, so I have to read something a little bit lighter or more whimsical. Okay, moving on. Now we're going to talk about words we use to describe books that we've read or that we are reading. And something to notice is that a lot of these words are about feelings, because that's what a book does. That's what a good book does at least. It makes you feel something. So you'll see a lot of these words are about how you feel. The first is heavy going, and you could also just say heavy. Now, heavy going, it means that it's difficult to get through the book. Now, that could be because it uses a lot of high vocabulary and complex sentences, or it could be that the emotional content of the book is difficult to read. It's very sad or it's very scary. So maybe if you're studying a psychology textbook, that could be heavy going. Or if you're reading a novel about a war somewhere, that could be very heavy. because it's very difficult to keep reading through. Typically, you might say something like, I really enjoy to read books that are heavy going. Or you can say, I don't really enjoy reading books that are heavy going. The next word is a real page turner. And that's a really common word to use in the Western world to describe a very good book. And that means literally what it says, a real page turner. Page turner, to turn a page. So a real page turner is a book that you want to keep turning the pages. It makes you want to keep turning pages. And the reason it does that is because you really want to find out what's going to happen next. So you might say something like, oh, this book that I'm reading right now, it's a real page turner. I can't put it down. I stayed up until 3 a.m. last night reading it because I couldn't stop. That would be a good example of how to use that word in a sentence. The next word is spine tingling. So we have the word spine here, and that's this part of your body. And we also have tingling, and that's like an electric feeling. So spine tingling is a book that makes you feel kind of excited. Now it could be excited, happy excited, or it could be kind of scared, like a little bit scared. So it makes you feel a little bit excited. So perhaps you might use it in a sentence like this. I like to read at night. I like to read horror books at night. And it's dark, and it really gives me a very spine-tingling feeling when I'm reading these books. The next word is poignant. Poignant. And poignant means something that evokes a heavy emotional feeling. It makes you feel something real deep, usually sadness. So poignant is a word that you can use to describe a heavy book that has a lot of emotional content in it. So you might say you were reading a book. So for example, you might say, I was finishing this book about a war, and there was a very poignant moment at the end of the book when the characters had to say goodbye forever, for example. And the next is a tearjerker. Now that's something that's really cool about English, is a lot of times if you look at the word, it gives you a very strong image of what the word means. And this is a great example of that. So a tear is, when you cry, a tear. And then a jerker, so jerk means to pull, right? So a tear jerker is a book that pulls your tears out. It's kind of a strange image, but it's a book that really makes you feel sad. Well, I guess it could be happy. It could be a tear jerker if it's like a happy sad, if that makes sense. So a lot of romantic books or romance books, they could be real tear jerkers, and also maybe a kind of genre called a coming of age story. Could be a tear jerker, coming of age. Now, coming of age story is a story about a person who is sort of becoming a man, a boy becoming a man or a girl becoming a woman. It's about growing up and maturing. And oftentimes those books are tear jerkers. Moving on, we got two more. And these mean more or less the same thing. First is gripping, and the second is riveting. Gripping and riveting. And they both mean kind of the same thing. And it's what I was just talking about. You can see what it means. So grip means to like hold something hard with your hand. So gripping is a book that grabs you and won't let you go. It's very good and you don't want to stop reading it. It's a real page turner. And rivet is the same idea. And a rivet is it's in do with machining. It's how do you attach two pieces of metal with a big machine? You rivet it together, right? So a riveting book, you're riveted to the book. You can't look away from it. It's just, you want to keep reading it. So a lot of times books are real page turners because they're so gripping and riveting. So you might use that in a sentence by saying, yeah, the book that I read, that I finished last week, the story was so gripping, I didn't want to put the book down. I kept reading and reading and reading. It was riveting. That could be a good way to use those two words. Okay, so the next one is unraveling of the plot. Now, unravel means to take apart like a knotted thread. For example, like if you had a ball of thread and you would unravel it, you would make it straight. Or if there's a sweater and you pull a string, it starts to unravel, it starts to come apart. So unraveling of the plot, that means when you as the reader start to figure out what's going on in the plot. Now obviously this kind of vocabulary is something that you're going to use for mysteries or books that you're not exactly sure what's happening. It could be like maybe a sci-fi when it starts in a place, in an environment where you're not familiar with. So unraveling the part means when you as the reader start to figure out what's happening. So unraveling of the plot. On the IELTS Speaking, if you're asked what kind of books you like, you could say something like this. I really like books that are a real page turner, that are poignant and are gripping. But my favorite kind of books are books where there is an unraveling of the plot, where as a reader, I have to figure out what's going on. I really love that. Okay, moving on to the next word. Next we've got enchanting. Enchanting. Now, enchanting, if you see the word right there, enchant, that means to cast a spell on somebody. And this word enchanting is something we use to describe books that are magical, maybe magical realism or fantasy, these kinds of books. And that means, magical, fantasy, and fun. Enchanting book. So you can also use that to describe a character in the book. Maybe the lead character is very enchanting and he can use his charm to convince other people in the story to do things that maybe they don't want to do. The next word is informative. Informative. And you can see it's the same root as information. And informative means to tell somebody about something or to teach somebody about something. To teach about something. I'm just going to write ST there for something. So informative book is a book that teaches you about something. Now, if you're asked what kind of books do you like to read on the IELTS exam, you might say something like, well, I like to read sci-fi and adventure books and books that might be spine-tingling, but I really like a fiction book that's also informative because it's like a special bonus. You get to read a book that's a nice story, but you also get to learn something. The next word is thought-provoking. Thought-provoking. And provoking, the root is provoke, and that means to come out. So a thought-provoking book is a book that makes you think. It makes you think. It makes you think. Now, a thought-provoking book, you can use it to describe fiction books and non-fiction books. It can be used for both. Most oftentimes when it's in fiction books, you might say something like, I really liked the story in that book because it was so thought-provoking. I was thinking about it for days and days afterwards. The next word is adventurous. Adventurous, and that's pretty straightforward. That's usually to describe a story that moves pretty quickly and very big action happens. There's a lot of action. Usually the characters in this kind of book are going on a journey somewhere. So I'm going to write here, action and a journey. And that's an adventurous book. And the last word that we have is whimsical. Whimsical. And whimsical is a playful and fun book. Right? A whimsical book is very different than a heavy book. They're opposites. So if you're asked on the IELTS speaking exam to tell me about a book that you've read and what you liked about it, you could say something like this. I read a book called The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. And it was a really good book because it was so thought-provoking. I thought about it for days and days after I finished it. It was also a little whimsical because the things that happened in the book weren't very heavy. And it was still informative in that it taught me a lot about how to live life in a good way. That might be a good answer for that question. Okay, moving on from vocabulary, now we're going to talk about some sentence patterns that you can use to describe books. The first we have, I see myself a bit in the character of. Let's break that down a little bit. A bit means a little. And the character are the people, sometimes animals, depending on what you're reading, but it's usually a living thing, usually a person in the book. So to see yourself in a character means that you can relate to that character. It means you can relate to this character. So you might say something like, I can see myself a bit in the character of Edward, the scientist, because he's always trying to find the answers to the problems that he finds in the book. And in my life, I'm like that a lot too. I'm always trying to find answers to the problems that I have in my life. That could be a way that you can use that sentence pattern. The next one is, the story grabbed me from the get-go. Now, if you remember, we talked a bit ago about a word, gripping. This is the same idea. The story grabbed me. It was so interesting. It hooked me so much that I couldn't stop reading it. Now, from the get-go, that means from the beginning. That's another way to say from the beginning. From the beginning. So get-go here means from the beginning. The story grabbed me from the beginning. I was interested right away. The action started on page 1, and then I couldn't stop reading. It was a page turner. Now here, you could say the story. That's perfectly fine. Works great. You could also say the plot. Now the plot in a story, it goes with movies and books as well, but the plot is the sequence of events in the story. It's how the character goes from the beginning to the end of the story. And that's the plot. Okay, so the next sentence pattern is, the story has characters. Now the stories have characters that do what? The story has characters that all have magical powers, all have superpowers. Or maybe you might say the story has characters that remind me of my family. Right? You can say a lot of different things. The story has characters that, and then here you can put a verb, almost any verb. The story has characters that can fly. The story has characters that spend all night reading. The story has characters that fall in love and get married and have a baby. So if you're asked on the IELTS exam, tell me about a book that you read and what you liked about it, you might say something like this. I finished this book called Manifesting the Monkey, and it was a really interesting story because it had characters that went on a great adventure to find the secret of life, the meaning of life. And along the way, they got into a lot of trouble and they had some big problems that they had to solve. And that was a very interesting book. It was gripping. Next sentence pattern is the story is based on. Now again, you could switch plot to here. You could say the plot is based on. That would be okay too. The story is based on. Now based on, what that means is where does the origin of this story come from? Where does the idea of this story come from? So the story is based on what we often say is on a real story. Or we might say on real life events. Right? The story is based on real life events. And that means that something happened in the world and then an author came and took those events and made them into a story that we can now read as a book. You might also say the story is based on a movie, or what we often have is the movie based on a book. The book usually comes first, so we usually have a movie that is based on a book. Okay, next sentence pattern is it's set in. It's set in. Now so here we're talking about characters, right? What kind of characters are in a book? Next we've got plot, and now we got setting. And these are three key elements that every book has. Every fiction book has: a plot, characters, and setting. So here it's set in, and then you can describe where it's set in. It's set in ancient Rome, for example, right? Ancient Rome. And ancient means, as you know, a long, long time ago. So ancient Rome, it's set in ancient Rome means, now we know that the story takes place in ancient Rome. And this is very useful to answer the question of, tell me about a book that you recently read. You could say, I finished this book called The Colosseum, and it's set in ancient Rome, and the characters are gladiators, and they have to fight every day to stay alive. And some of the action was spine-tingling. It was a riveting book. So it's set in, and then you have kind of like a place or a time. So you can say it's set in the 1950s, for example. Or you can say it's set in the future. It's set in the past. It's set in the 1950s, the 1970s. You can put a lot of different kinds of things in here. You could say it's set in the mountains of Nebraska, or the flatlands of England. Or you can say a specific city. It's set in London, England. It's set in Paris, France. That's very useful for describing your book. Because when you describe a book, before you get into details, you want to get a top level explanation. So then that's a great time to use this sentence pattern. Oh, I loved this book. It was set in Paris, France in the 1920s. And then right away, the listener knows where exactly you are. And that's a great way to help you be understood well. Okay, so the next one is to cut a long story short. To cut a long story short. Now this is an idiom that we use often in conversation, and it means exactly what it says. Like a lot of times when we tell a story about what happens to us in our lives, it could be quite a long story. I mean, we could just kind of go on and on and on. So we say this, and that tells the listener that we're skipping a bunch of details, but they're not essential to the plot. They're not essential to the plot, and we're going to kind of summarize the story very, very quickly. So I traveled around a lot, and so there's a long story about how I got to travel, but I could just say, to cut a long story short, I bought a one-way ticket and left. Right? That's a way to use that in a sentence. Okay, last sentence pattern, and this is couldn't put it down. Couldn't put it down. Now this is used to describe a real page turner, right? This is used to describe a riveting book. These are all, so a real page turner, a riveting book, these are books that you couldn't put it down. And any reader, any avid reader out there has had that experience where they know they need to go to bed, but they're just going to read one more page, and then one more page, and then one more page, because they couldn't put it down. So this is another great sentence pattern to use for that question about describing a book that you've read and what you liked about it. You know, you might say, I was reading this book called The Colosseum. It's set in 1900s Rome, and the characters are very strong and powerful, but at the same time they're very human. They're very human. And I could see myself in a bit in the character of Romeo, because he's very charming and handsome, and he is very funny as well. The book was a real page turner. I couldn't put it down. That would be a good way to use that. All right, guys, that's about it for today. Today's topic was books. We covered vocabulary and sentence patterns to help you describe the books that you've read and to describe your reading habits. And so I challenge you right now to go to your bookshelf and to take a book and use some of this language that we've discussed today in your own life, to use it to describe a book that you have actually read.